Time to bounce, stop, splash, and cheer. To celebrate all things black and gold. To celebrate Night Nation. To celebrate you. So join us on April 13th for UCF Day of Giving. And help us connect, discover, create, and unleash potential.
Hello. Hello, welcome. Hello, welcome to UCF Celebrates the Arts. I'm Sebastian Garcia, a fourth-year undergraduate history student at UCF. This festival provides a unique opportunity for UCF artists to perform and exhibit in world-class facilities and for our community to enjoy a wide range of creative activities we pursue at the university. UCF Celebrates the Arts is sponsored in part by the state of Florida, Department of State, Division of Arts and Culture, the Florida Council on Arts and Culture, and the National Endowment for the Arts. This festival will not be possible without the support of our sponsors, which also include OUC, the Reliable One, and Orlando's Downtown Development Board. Your support of the arts is important too. UCF's Day of Giving is April 13th. We thought one day was a little too short though, and are asking you to please make a gift today while you're here at the festival. There is a QR code on the back of your festival guide, and I'm asking you to please use it to make a donation before you leave the building tonight. Your donation provides students like me the opportunity to be here today. You can specify what area you'd like to support. UCF Celebrates the Arts, student scholarships, a new performing arts center on campus, or even something unrelated to the arts and humanities. We'd like you to support what you love. Our programs are digital this year. You can find information like performer names, song lists, bios, and much more on each event page at arts.ucf.edu/celebrates. In this room, you can see a sampling of Dr. Martínez-Fernández editorial posters, which by the way are really amazing. At the end of this presentation, there are 2 copies over there to my right that are unfortunately not available for purchasing, but they're available for viewing. However, there are copies, there's a discount flyer that gives you 30% off of the book order. And on the discount sheet, it says that it's valid until March 31st, but it's actually valid until April 15th. So you have enough time to use the discount and get the book. We also have a sign-up sheet for your weekly columns, or
maybe we could get one.
Okay, yeah. So we also, in that same area, we'll have a sign-up sheet for those who are interested in receiving his weekly columns via email. On behalf of all the artists, technicians, and performers at UCF, thank you for joining us this evening. Now, without further ado, it is my absolute honor and pleasure to introduce my mentor, UCF Pegasus Professor of History and Creators Nationally Syndicated columnist, Dr. Luis Martínez-Fernández, who will be presenting When the World Turned Upside Down, Words and Images on Politics, Culture, and the Unimaginable Events of 2019 to 2022.
Thank you, Sebastian. Sebastian is one of our best students. And if you see him later, you might want to ask him about what he's majoring in, because he has 2 very interesting majors. And there's something wrong when the student has a better tailor than the professor, but it's fine. Okay, When the World Turned Upside Down, Words and Images on Politics, Culture, and the Unimaginable Events of 2019-2022. I see many familiar faces, many friends, colleagues. Thank you for coming tonight. It means a lot to me. And it feels good to be here. I'm delighted to participate in this festival. This is actually my 2nd year in a row being part of this festival. And last year, some of you were here, I offered an illustrated presentation entitled Cast in Bronze and Chiseled Out of Stone, the story of the Caribbean as told by its statues. And I enjoyed it so much that I proposed this presentation for this year. The words stem from my latest book, When the World Turned Upside Down. Authors usually don't select the titles, but I had the opportunity to select this one, and we changed it halfway, and we can talk about that later. It's a collection of 66 opinion columns that I wrote first for the online media outlet, the Globe Post, and then for Creators Syndicate, which I joined in September 2020. Now, had my teachers thought that I would be joining a syndicate, it would have been perhaps a crime syndicate and not a syndicate of columnists. Just kidding. But I have retained some of that irreverence, and you will hear from that both in the posters, which I call editorial posters. There are 32 that I'm showing tonight, and I have created about 70 of them, and they're parallel creations. At the same time that I was generating ideas for columns, I was also coming up with these concepts. I'm not an artist. I just like to play with images and ideas. These are things habits that I developed as a university student at the University of Puerto Rico. I met somebody earlier who went to that esteemed university, and that's why I believe so much in higher education and the transformative power of education. Now, there are major differences, of course, between both creative genres, but there's some similarities that I would like to note. Both begin with ideas that are fostered by curiosity and nurtured by reflection and research. These take shape first as concepts, then they begin to shape up as outlines or sketches, and then I revise them and over again, and that's the key to writing. I don't know of any author who can just write a first draft that is genius. It takes work. So the same playing with words and ideas, I also apply that to the graphic design. Of course, motivated by the unimaginable events that we have all witnessed over the past 4 or 5 years. The world changed so dramatically, and I decided that I needed to use an overused word that sometimes we associate with Madonna to reinvent myself. The world is turning upside down, and there are all these topics that I think I can provide some historical perspective. Now, my preference is not to read in front of an audience, but since I am going to be sharing with you essays that appeared in my columns and were crafted with much care, I'd rather not lose that aspect of the prose if I were to speak extemporaneously. So, the materials here, many of them are controversial, irreverent, and what I'm presenting tonight is the G-rated version. If you want the R version, then you may want to get the book. This is a general audience, and nobody likes to be hit over the head ideologically or preached at, so I'm going to maintain that to a minimum. So, periodization. Historians engage in periodization. We divide history into periods, and we establish watersheds and chronological demarcations. That's one of the things that historians do. But it is very difficult to recognize a watershed in your own time. Sometimes I tell my students where people in Florence in the 1450s, they had no idea that they were part of the Renaissance. That, of course, came later. But, and I'm sure you will agree, the dramatic transformations worldwide over the last 4 or 5 years have been something that tells us that we have entered a new period, not just in U.S. history, but in global history. A few months ago, I was invited to select and write brief notes of what I recognize as the best books to understand today's biggest domestic and global changes. And here they are. Their authors come from different disciplines. They focus on different subjects. Politically, they also come from different parts of the spectrum. I think that is very healthy to hear from George Will, for example, because he says things that the others don't dare say. It's very, very healthy. They have, however, a common perspective that things are going in the wrong direction, and they do leave a little bit of space for optimism, and that's something that we should always leave, as dark and difficult as the times may seem. So I found Robert Reich's The System and one of his previous books, Super Capitalism, that came out in 2008, particularly enlightening and influential in my own column writing. Reich supports the provocative thesis that despite acrimonious partisan polarization, the real contest is not between the right and the left, but between democracy and oligarchy, and that the vast majority of citizens, Republican, Democrat, Independents, are getting poorer and wield, and this is his term, near zero political power. Oligarchs, J.P. Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon is their embodiment, and I like the way he starts that book, because he said, I got a call from Jamie Dimon protesting that he had been presented in a bad light. You should read it. And Dimon wants to have his rags to riches stories and how much difficulties, and then he says, you had no difficulties, you were privileged. So that's the way he starts the book. And what happens is that this enormous capital allows powerful individuals to further rig the system through campaign contributions, successful lobbying, and even criminal actions for which, if they are caught, only pay nominal fines. I've always asked myself, how can, and I'm gonna pick on them, okay, bankers, can break these laws and then nobody goes to jail and they get these fines. I conceived my first editorial poster in 2017. There's nothing fancy. I borrowed somebody else's stock image, but I was pondering. I remember the afternoon when I did that at my office at UCF, that something is wrong. People are no longer ashamed of their actions. February 28, 2019. This is from one of the columns, actually one of the first columns I wrote. What Professor Robert Reich called super capitalism, a brutal, unethical, and corrupt get-out-of-my-way economic system that instead of promoting the much-hailed doctrine of free market, and this is one of the great contradictions, capitalism is supposed to be built on the free market, yet those in power do whatever they can to eliminate competition, crush it with establishments of monopolies and crony capitalism. This radical brand of capitalism, short of amiable to democracy, thrives on the destruction of representative democracy. Russia and China are cases in point, and we really don't have to go that far to realize the connection between crony capitalism and the erosion of democracy. This is the dawning of the age of nonsense, continuing with the subject of how things have changed. I also began to notice a proliferation of nonsense coming out of almost every area of human activity. Think about it. Entertainment, the media, politics, education, and including the realm of academia, which I inhabit. We also have our share of nonsense, and maybe we can talk about that later. So I like to call them editorial posters. It sounds better than memes. I think it sounds more sophisticated. So don't call them memes, editorial posters. And this is an allusion to the song, "This is the Dawning of the Age of Aquarius." Some of you will remember that was a hymn. I was too little, but during the late 60s and early 70s, yes, I did miss the hippie phase. I just grew into the me generation of the 1980s. Well, that happens. It's by the Fifth Dimension, and it was the opening of the musical Hair. I will not dwell on the topic of nonsense, but think about this. Think about the ads on TV that you watch every day. The nonsense that we're subjected to. I don't know why you have people dancing up and down to sell medicine for asthma or some other product. But that really tells us something, because ads are circulate because they work. And then you ask, if they work, what does that tell us about the audience? And then another one, I can't help myself, but Bad Bunny. I hope I'm not offending anybody, because I will be offending people throughout the night. He made it to the cover of Time magazine. I remember the last Puerto Riqueño who made it to the cover of Time magazine, Luis Muñoz Marín, the father of modern Puerto Rico. So I guess it doesn't take even talent. That's my opinion. Okay. Now, continuing with these changes, robotization. Oops. Renaissance nudity. There's a problem with that. Okay. Much better. What the heck? We're all adults here. When science journalist Nicholas Carr first published The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains in 2010, it rang like a 5-bell fire alarm, alerting the world about the mostly negative effects of pervasive exposure to the internet. Carr, and I used this book in some of my classes, noticed experiencing, quote, uncomfortable sense that someone or something has been tinkering with my brain, remapping the neural circuitry, reprogramming the memory, and the quote. And then he set out to find answers to this. He was not comfortable. And so he studied the extant neuroscientific literature on a wide array of topics, including brain plasticity. Remember, my generation, where we were in school, we were told, don't drink, because every time you drink or get drunk, you're gonna lose brain cells. That was the orthodoxy. But then it turned out, not suggesting that you go and drink, but it's an example of how the science has developed in terms of brain plasticity. Let's see, okay. So The Shallows is now even more relevant in these times of TikTok. And I have one column. One of the things that I enjoy doing is playing with the titles, Wars and Rumors of Wars in Times of TikTok. And it remains an excellent guide, this book, for baby boomers like myself to understand the culture and minds of millennials and Gen Zers. It's important that we understand one another. This is from a recent 2-part column that I wrote on ChatGPT in January. From the perspective of the long view of history, we can look back at the most transformative technological innovations: the domestication of animals and plants, the printing press, the steam engine, steel, electric light, the telegraph, antibiotics, computers, space travel, and the internet. But ChatGPT and its soon-to-be unveiled competitors bring us into another dimension of change. It is a turning point, one without return, in what Nicholas Carr called, quote, the cybernetic blurring of mind and machine. We are witnessing the displacement of the mind by machines, which he warned in 2010, quote, poses a threat to our integrity as human beings. I'm really concerned because I see this as another dimension of change. It's playing with our humanity. I played a little bit with those ChatGPT and asked it to write an essay, and it was largely nonsense, but it's scary what's in the works. Okay, there's a wide acceptance of these dramatic changes, mostly for the worse, and which are encapsulated in the very unfortunate phrase that this is the new normal. March 31st, 2020. Before the coronavirus, there were several global hotspots of tension with the potential of escalating into armed conflict. Among them, the most explosive were Israel and Iran, Turkey and the United States, India and Pakistan, North Korea and the US allies, South Korea and Japan, and the United States and China. It does not help to have a cast of world leaders that includes megalomaniacs, expansionists, bullies, and at least 3 confirmed assassins. I don't think I need to mention them. And to think that Francis Fukuyama, who is the author of that famous essay, The End of History, he anticipated, quote, powerful nostalgia for the time when history existed, and feared, quote, the prospect of centuries of boredom. What is unfolding before our eyes is neither new nor normal, and it's certainly not boring at all. And then came the COVID-19 epidemic, and several of the columns are deal with that subject and its global ramifications. August 17, 2020. On July 14, CDC Director Dr. Robert Redfield blamed Northerners who had headed south for Memorial Day weekend vacations for the latest surge of COVID-19 cases. Harvard scientists and New York Governor Mario Cuomo, we haven't heard from him in a long time, retorted that it was not the North's fault, pointing the blame at Southern politicians who had rushed to reopen their states prematurely. States are also divided on mandates to wear masks. The line of demarcation running roughly along the Mason-Dixon line, the same line of contention of the antebellum, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. Actually, there's an entire section of the book in which I draw the parallels of the US during the 1850s and during the Civil War, and what has transpired in this country since 2008. James Madison, with his extraordinary political wisdom and foresight, could have not anticipated that so many Americans would come to cherish the freedom to not wear a mask as almost worthy of inclusion in the hallowed Bill of Rights. No one would have foreseen just 3 months ago that such issue would divide the nation to the extent that it has. There's an entire section on education, and the section is entitled, I Never Left the Classroom. And it is true. I entered the University of Puerto Rico in 1978, wide-eyed and just disoriented. I remember walking into a classroom because I didn't know that in the university things were different, that they don't have bells, right, to change from one class to other. So I walked into a classroom and I thought it was early, but everybody was there, and the professor told me, no, you're here for the next class. That was my first day at the University of Puerto Rico, and I decided never to leave the university. All these years, it's over 40 years. March 21 and 28, 2021. Several studies confirm my personal observations that students are facing more academic difficulties. One study reveals that nearly 3 out of 4 students were having problems focusing with their academic work. Another study demonstrated that 80% experienced lower levels of motivation to complete their work and even show up for class. This semester, I have had a larger than usual proportion of students withdrawing from my courses, and or stopping attending class. The number who are behind in their assignments is also through the roof. Students and faculty members are experiencing Zoom fatigue. A survey found that nearly 1/3 of undergraduates in the country, quote, never want to take another class via Zoom. And I don't want to teach another one either. I'm anxiously looking forward to the end of the COVID-19 pandemic, the end of Zoom-y education, and the return to face-to-face interactions with my students and colleagues without social distancing and without masks. September 8, 2020. Something epic used to require heroes and heroic actions, but the words epic and hero have lost their meaning. In the late 1300s, the word crossed the English Channel, or is it the French Channel? Originally from the Greek language, hero was first used in reference to demigods. Later, it was applied to human beings who displayed extraordinary courage in the face of death or danger. Being a hero, Will Rogers said, is about the shortest-lived profession on earth. But today, many individuals bestow the blanket heroic and patriotic status on entire groups of people. All those who serve in the military, regardless of their actions, are heroes. So are members of law enforcement bodies, whether they act heroically or abusively. Farmers and ranchers who feed America are heroes too. And I'm, of course, quoting. Border Patrol agents are quote-unquote superheroes. What about teachers, many of whom are being deployed to schools in the face of potential COVID-19 infection, perhaps even death? When does a pandemic cross the line to become genocide? Okay. As you may have already gathered, I have a lot of fun with my columns, and I play with ideas, I play with the titles. What I'm going to read comes out of one from March 2021 entitled, "Is that a Constitution in your pocket?" With so many millions of pocket constitutions in circulation and dozens bulging and popping in and out of politicians' pockets, one would expect that Americans would have at least some basic knowledge of the nation's constitutional foundations. But survey after survey continue to document the general population's ignorance about the Constitution. And this is shocking. The Annenberg Public Policy Center's latest poll on the subject showed that only half of Americans can name the 3 branches of government. That is shocking. Carrying a copy in one's pocket is a symbolic action, but unless we read and respect the Constitution, democracy remains at risk. Ignorance is the greatest domestic threat to our democracy, and teachers are our first responders. Now, this editorial poster is not original, neither the wording nor the composition, but I used it in one of my columns in which I talked about the topic of the culture wars of the 1990s, which are echoing as we speak. Among the culture wars' collateral damage was the teaching profession. Some voices chastised school teachers as incompetent, uncaring, and greedy, for goodness sake. Someone coined and others repeated the insulting slogan, "Those who can, do, and those who can't, teach." I remember seeing a satirical political cartoon in which an angry taxpayer demanded that teachers' salaries be cut. When asked why was he proposing such a thing, he responded, "I have no power over the astronomical salaries of athletes and movie stars, but I can do something about the compensation of my local teachers." Years later, teachers and their advocates retorted with a slogan of their own. One can purchase this online, pins, t-shirts, bumper stickers that read, "Those who can, teach. Those who cannot, pass laws about teaching." Okay, more controversy and more irreverence. The 7 deadly sins of the modern university. May 8, 2021. I want to say that this is not in reference to UCF. This is other universities. Okay? I'm actually proud to be a professor at UCF, and it's a great place. It's not perfect, but let me read this from this column. My 40-odd years in university classrooms, including the past 14 months in the Alice in Wonderlandish Zoom environment, give me a long-term perspective on higher education and what anthropologists call participant observation, experiences on the changing roles, values, and culture of American higher education. While the term ivory tower, Merriam-Webster, quote, a secluded place that affords the means of treating practical issues with an impractical, often escapist attitude, is generally meant as a criticism, I argue that a healthy dose of seclusion and impracticality, even a bit of escapism, are needed more than any time before, given our society's obsession with the practical, the utilitarian, the vocational, the profitable, the quantifiable, the STEMish, the faddish, and the crude. And I'm not calling, of course, for a return to the 1970s and 70s, much less to the Middle Ages when the first universities emerged. And I confess that I engage in these friendly, from the inside criticisms with some trepidation, knowing that the sworn enemies of higher education may use them for nefarious purposes. A few years ago, I presented the conference paper, The 7 Deadly Sins of the Modern American University. While I have since identified at least twice as many additional sins, these were the original ones. STEMism, bureaucratism, metricsism, assessmentism, grantism, credentialism, and footballism. Number 1, STEMism. The extreme fixation on research, publishing, and teaching science, technology, engineering, and mathematics threatens to reduce universities to tech centers tasked with training students in narrow utilitarian fields while neglecting and marginalizing the humanistic core of a university education. STEM without the flowers is just a STEM. And that's why I'm so proud to be part of this festival, which reminds the university, reminds the community that at the very heart of the university are the humanities. Everything else comes and goes. Number 2, bureaucratism. Again, this is about some other universities. Over the past few decades, universities have taken on a whole range of new responsibilities beyond their core missions of teaching and research. Some are necessary. Others are actual hindrances to learning and scholarship. According to the National Center for Educational Statistics, between 1980-81 and 2014-2015, the proportion of expenditures in university instructional costs dropped from 41% to 29%. Administrative costs, other studies reflect, have since surpassed teaching-related expenses in some universities. Sins 3, 4, 5, metricsism, assessmentism, and grantism. These are interrelated, compounding obsessions that devaluate the importance of the intangible, the unmeasurable, and the transcendental. Metricists, and I don't mean scholars of poetic metrics, believe that almost everything can be reduced to numbers by which universities must live and die. Mr. Bean Counter, can you tell me how to quantify the value of inspiring or transforming the life of a single student? How many points does that get me in the end-of-year faculty report? The assessmentist, the root of the word is a giveaway, is equally obsessed, anally so, with numbers, but delights in using buzzwords such as institutional effectiveness and accountability. All institutions, particularly those that receive public funds, should strive for effectiveness. and all members of a university community should be accountable. But assessmentism means an unending quest for data, much of it nonsensical, gathered to justify bureaucratic sprawl and satisfy politicians, donors, sports fans, and others. Much of this data is gathered through inopportune, time-consuming surveys. I'm sure you get requests to fill out surveys on a weekly basis and not a daily basis. And they tell you, it only takes 20 minutes to complete. I have, for one, declared a moratorium on surveys. That one, by the way, took 40 minutes. Let's take the ass out of assessment. Grantism is yet another numbers fetish. The number and monetary value of research grants has replaced the actual importance of research and publication. Just thumb through a glossy university year report and you will see the exaggerated value placed on the amount of grant money received by a particular institution. Some refer to that the group of the faculty who bring the most money to a university as the Millionaires Club. How foolish. As a historian, I belong to a paupers club and I'm proud of it. 6, credentialism. Call me recalcitrant if you wish, but I'm not giving up on the belief that universities are, at their core, places of teaching and learning. Most everyone needs a job, and universities provide professional credentials necessary to pursue a variety of employment opportunities. But most faculty believe that we are educating students for more than a diploma and a paycheck, to become fulfilled, socially conscious, productive citizens who see learning as a lifelong trajectory. Sin number 7, and this is the one that gets me in most trouble, believe it or not. Footballism. I will be brief because I don't want to get in trouble with one of the university's most powerful constituencies, but I will just paraphrase American philosopher Rodney Dangerfield. I went to a football game the other night and a university sprung out. Reading, thinking, daring to be different. I think reading and writing have become countercultural. Reading cures fascism. And let me read from an April 16, 2022 column. There is something about poets, perhaps their gentle sensitivities, that makes them favorite targets of fascist and communist brutality. Like canaries in the dark mine of history, poets are often the first to inhale the deadly fumes of violence and war. They stop chirping and pandemonium ensues. Spanish poet and playwright Federico Garcia Lorca was among the early victims of Spanish fascism. He was executed point blank in 1936 by a fascist insurgent who put a bullet through his bulbous, verse-filled head, not before telling him why he was killing him. For being red and being gay. Of course, an expletive was used then. 4 years later, with Generalissimo Francisco Franco's regime firmly in place, a fascist judge sentenced to death another Andalusian poet, Miguel Hernández, who had regaled Spain with some of the most tender but also trenchant verses ever written. Among them the poem, Menos tu vientre, except for your wound, which was inspired by his wife's pregnancy. And verses to his unborn child, whom he anticipated, clenched, fisted, will be born. That's a beautiful verse. His execution commuted. Hernandez died in prison, consumed by tuberculosis in 1942, and he was only 31 years old. A printing press is an army. This is a quote from another poet, also politician, Cuban patriot Jose Martí. He probably picked this quote or this idea from none other than John Gutenberg, who knew a little bit about presses, and he said, a printing press is an army of 26 lead soldiers that can conquer the world. What a beautiful image in terms of the power of the written word. February 19, 2019. Okay. I'm going to skip a couple of them. Just some of these ideas, and these are things that I share with my students. They're counting on your ignorance, rethink, disappoint them, and at the very least, they know that you know, and there's a lot of power in that. Let me jump to 20. Okay. October 30, 2020, a column entitled 1989, History's Stubborn Twist, and the commencement speaker who warned us to remain vigilant. Your time, 1990, Tom Brokaw told us in his unassuming Midwestern voice. He was my commencement speaker at Duke University, and he said, this is a time of explosive, dizzying, exhilarating, cataclysmic change. I remember 1989. So he reviewed the headlines of the previous year, beginning with the protest and bloody massacre at Tiananmen Square. Remember the goddess of democracy, that statue, and the unknown tank man? Then came Poland's solidarity movement that ignited a pandemic of freedom that spread throughout Central and Eastern Europe, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and on and on and on. And even Romania's Draculesque communist dictator, Nicolae Ceausescu, fell from power. The stake of democracy rammed through his chest by seas of torch-bearing Romanians craving freedom and democracy. Winds of change swept far beyond Europe. You can feel the earth moving now, continued Brokaw, as freedom and independence erupt with volcanic force from the tip of South Africa to the northern Baltics, from remote reaches of Mongolia to the rarefied heights of Nepal. The arts, I'm a fan of the arts. I'm not an artist. I love to hang around artists to see if something rubs off. And I think I know a little bit of math. So earth minus art is I mean, it's a world not very much worth living. This is another idea. I remember the day I was in a meeting and it came to mind, and I shared that idea right away. This is one of my favorite ones. Stop STEM bullying. I think I coined that term. February 19, 2019. While we live in Orwellian times, truth is fake and fake is truth. Good is bad and bad is good. Fact is fiction and fiction is fact. And as George Orwell's dystopian classic 1984 tells us, ignorance is strength. Okay, strength only for those to insist on keeping the masses ignorant. It is time for historians to step in. We also live at a time when history, as well as the arts and humanities, are increasingly neglected in schools and universities, sacrificed at the altar of the gods of STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. That, however, is largely based on incorrect assumptions about history's lack of practical application and the belief that its study sheds light exclusively on the past. Something that I've been doing over the last 4 years is using history to try to understand and make sense of current events. The training and practice of history provides a long-term, telescopic perspective and sensitivity towards the interconnectedness of human actions and reactions, and fosters an intuitiveness that helps understand the present and even anticipate the future. Now, Those of you who know me know that I've dedicated my life to writing about the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic. Those are my traditional areas of expertise. But this book is different. This is the first of my books that does not deal primarily with my comfort zone of the Caribbean. But there are a couple of sections that include Cuba and Puerto Rico. Jose Marti again. Cuba and the United States are bound by an intractable geographic reality, the proverbial 90 miles. And since the start of the Cuban Revolution, 1959, both have tensely coexisted like a couple forced to live under the same roof after a nasty divorce. That must be awful. As a Cuban-born author who lives in Florida and writes about Cuba, my heart, brain, and pen are split along both sides of the Florida Straits. And as a defender of freedom and democracy, I wholeheartedly support pro-democracy movements on the island. And by the same token, I'm concerned about efforts to weaken democracy and civil rights in Florida and the other 49 states. Despite its utter failure in Cuba and imperfect success in the United States, the pursuit of freedom and democracy are foundational values shared by both people. The father of the Cuban Patria, Jose Marti, ranks among the hemisphere's most important and influential freedom fighters and proponents of democratic rule and racial equality. Everybody in this country should be exposed to the writings of Jose Marti. And may I suggest his essay, his long essay, Our America. And everyone should read the poem, The White Rose. Martí knew that there was a time for poetry and a time for war. He died in battle in 1896 while charging a Spanish battalion armed only with a small handgun. He was shot dead, riding a white horse, dressed in a three-piece suit. That's our Jose Martí. If you've been to Central Park South, you see that there are three statues of the liberators of the Americas. There is Simón Bolívar, José de San Martín, and our Jose Martí. The only one who died in battle was Jose Martí, who showed up one day, his first day in battle, and he was shot. The other two crossed the Andes back and forth, and they died of old age. There's something to be said about the tragic nature of Cuban history. And that's why for Cubans, and it's interesting because both Cubans who are with the regime and those who are against it, we both venerate the figure of Jose Martí. Okay. I experienced the thankless and disagreeable experience of publishing a history of the Cuban Revolution. It took me 10 years. I decided after that to avoid writing about Cuba. But the unimaginable events that started with the San Isidro artist movement in the fall of 2020 and the unprecedented mass protests of July 2021, I never thought that I would see those kinds of protests in Cuba. Not because Cubans were happy with the regime, but because it is important to understand the surveillance, the terror, and to understand the courage. You know, it's one thing to be pro-Cuban revolution. Okay, that's your thinking. Okay, but please explain to me, what does a revolution do? Beating up 11-year-old girls, throwing them into jail because they had participated in a mass protest. I don't think any Viva Castro promoter can explain that to me with a straight face. December 5, 2020, well, some international organizations such as Amnesty International and the International Society for Human Rights have brought attention to art censorship and the ongoing wave of repression. International artists and intellectuals, with minimal exceptions, neither see nor hear and much less speak. The great Cuban writer, a great Cuban writer would refer to them as los tres monos. Ni ven, ni escuchan, ni hablan. Why this silence? It may sound silly, but it is a matter of popularity and coolness. Supporting Cuban dissidents has never been cool. Artist Coco Fusco was until recently as cool as they come. Now she's not, because she spoke out against the oppression of fellow artists. And after writing Revolutionary Cuba, I became more uncool than ever before. Don't you dare censor that painting of the Virgin Mary made out of elephant dung, the cool ones say. What about my performance? I hear Tania Bruguera ask. And don't you dare remove that book from my local library, they say. And they're right about saying it. But why are my books and those of fellow Cuban exiles absent from Cuban libraries? Defund the police, they demand. What about La Policía Nacional Revolucionaria, my oppressed compatriots ask. Those who remain silent about Cuba are above all else kindred spirits of those tormented souls whom a 14th century Florentine writer described as, quote, pacing around with weary steps and slow, whose haggard looks express fatigue and woe. Inferno, Canto 23, The Hypocrites. Since the spontaneous and unprecedented Havana Malecón Seawall riot of 1994, Cuba has not witnessed large anti-government manifestations until November 2020, when around 200 artists and intellectuals of the San Isidro movement staged a protest in front of the Ministry of Culture. This is unheard of. Public manifestations? No. The government immediately repressed and suppressed the movement and its supporters. November 15, 2021, the protest that never was. In September, Cuban playwright Junior Garcia Aguilera, one of the leaders of the San Isidro movement, began organizing a protest through the Archipelago Group Facebook page. It was scheduled for November 15, and I got excited and I created this editorial poster. But the government unleashed civilian pro-government mobs to harass Garcia Aguilera and other organizers. The government banned the protest and kept Garcia Aguilera from embarking in a solo march on the 14th. He had intended to march carrying a white rose, an allusion to José Martí's poem. He had to settle for waving the rose through his window next to a handwritten note that said, "My house is being blockaded." Fearing for his safety, Garcia Aguilera left Cuba a few days later, bound for Madrid, where Martí had been deported in 1871 after authorities released him from prison in the Isle of Pines. Okay. This one is a Cuban insider joke. October 8, 2022. And you may have noticed that there's a common theme. I don't go after regular people who make mistakes, but I really go after tyrants. They deserve to be chastised. October 8, 2022. Even more unprecedented were the mass protests of July 11 to 14, 2021, when several thousand engaged in peaceful demonstrations in over 60 cities and towns. While the regime's shortcomings during the COVID-19 pandemic sparked that round of protests, citizens also protested shortages of food and basic necessities. They openly challenged the government, chanting "Libertad, libertad, libertad," and Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel's newly minted nickname, homophone of the Chinese beer brand Singapore. And I'm going to close with this one, actually. It's one of my favorites. Truth is always revolutionary, by Antonio Gramsci, a revolutionary, an Italian revolutionary. I think it's a good place to stop so that we can have time for questions and answers. Thank you very much. It's a little dark in here. Well, there are many things that I didn't read or say. Again, if you're interested, there's a book that brings all of them together. So I'm really interested in your questions, whatever they might be. Challenge me.
Is ignorance inevitable? Is there an opportunity to climb out of that?
If I believed that it was inevitable, I wouldn't be doing what I do for a living. I see it every day. I see the spark in students' eyes. Today I taught. I think I should get this one. Hello? Can you hear me? Today I was teaching history and historians, which is a very important class for history majors. And when I start that class, I tell my students, this is the most important history class that you're going to take in this university. Certainly not because I'm teaching it, but because in this class, you learn to think like a historian. You enter the laboratory of a historian and you begin to play with evidence. I'm convinced that even though the winds of ignorance are dominating, and there are people who benefit from ignorance, it's not inevitable. Ignorance can be contagious, but enlightenment can also be contagious. And we've had dark times in world history, and we've recovered from them. So I'm optimistic, Tony.
In your book, you spoke a bit about capitalism. And most of us as Americans just assume that democracy and capitalism are linked, and that capitalism without democracy is not possible. Do you expand on that a bit?
Yes, actually, there are a couple of columns that deal with that. I'm not against capitalism. Capitalism works in many areas. I think socialists are not good at building TV sets or cars. I don't know if you remember the Yugo, which had a lifetime of about 2.5 years at most, if he wasn't blown off over by a passing truck. But then I firmly believe that there are areas where capitalism doesn't work.